Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Hello and welcome again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. My name is Stephen Smart and I'm filling in today for our usual host, David Payne. This is the penultimate episode. It's just one more and then we're done. And we're just so pleased that you're able to be with us today and hope that it will be worthwhile from your point of view. I'm delighted today to welcome Tracy Radosevic, who is one of my heroes, actually, because I've seen her online performing Mark's Gospel, which, as many of you listeners and viewers will know, is one of my passions. And to see Tracy in action is really a delight. Tracy, it's wonderful to meet you first face to face for the first time. Can I ask you to tell us all a little bit about yourself, what you're up to, what you're doing now, your background, etc.?
Sure, and I might need to add hero in my introduction. I mean, thank you. I've never been called anybody's hero that I'm aware of before. So thank you. I'm Tracy Radosevic. I have been a freelance biblical storyteller since 1997. I'm in the United States. You might tell I don't have the same accent that you do, Stephen. I live in Baltimore, and I have been freelancing, which includes all kinds of things related to biblical storytelling, and not just performance, but teaching. I'm really an educator at heart. So to that point, I also, another one of my vocational caps is I'm an adjunct professor at two seminaries, one in Washington, D.C. and one here in Baltimore. And I got started with all of this when I was introduced to the Network of Biblical Storytellers International back in 1990, when I was serving as a director of Christian education in the local United Methodist Church in North Carolina. And it just changed my life. But I didn't realize quite how much it was going to change it. I just figured, I've got a new tool for my Christian ed work. And pretty quickly started getting asked to go elsewhere and to either teach others how to do it or to perform for them. And that just, exploded in a way that I never could have imagined. And so eventually the Network of Biblical Storytellers started an Academy for Biblical Storytelling, which is a one-year certification program. That was back in 2006 that they formed that, and they asked me to be the dean of that. So the freelance stuff, the adjunct teaching, and the dean of the Academy for Biblical Storytelling is probably tells you most of what you need to know about me.
You seem to be very, very busy. Is that the case?
Yeah, it is. It is. It's kind of a crazy way to cobble together a living, but no 2 days are alike, and I never get bored.
and Mark's Gospel is very dear to your heart. Is that true? I get that impression.
Yes, I was asked to perform the whole. I hadn't learned it. I had maybe I knew of other people within the network who had done it, and so it had almost kind of been maybe a thing that I considered doing. And then somebody just said, "Hey, we'll hire you to come and do it for us." And so that was the impetus. And so, gosh, it was at the late, whenever the I got to think 3 years ago for the lectionary cycle, but I don't know, in 2008 or 2009 when Mark was the lectionary text, I did that for Lent, and I used the learning of Mark as my Lenten discipline that year. So very intensely for the first month or so of Lent, I was daily, working on it, and I already knew big chunks of it. I had performed pieces of it,
Right.
for sure before then. So yeah. And then once I had that under my belt and had that first performance under my belt, I hung that shingle.
Brilliant.
Have story, we'll travel and perform. So.
Well, it's wonderful that you're now with us on this show, and actually
I'm thrilled.
We're going to be seeing a little bit of your performance of Mark later on. So that will be exciting for all of us. And if you're listening on a podcast, unfortunately, you won't be seeing Tracy, but you will definitely hear her performance anyway. So
Yes.
thank you so much, Tracy. What we're going to look at today is chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. And to listen to this reading from Lucy Warner will be our first task. So over to you, Lucy.
Mark chapter 16, verses 1 to 8, New International Version. Jesus has risen. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid.
So, Tracy, it is wonderful to be able to talk to you about this particular passage, because it's one of those passages which arouses a whole degree of controversy. I guess one of the things that people often ask about is this the ending of Mark's Gospel, or should we add the other bit, which appears in most Bibles, verses 9 to 20? What's your opinion on this?
I think there's no question it's the authentic ending. and I understand why early audiences felt the need to add to it, because it can be very disconcerting. It can leave you feeling unsatisfied in some ways, or incomplete. And so I do understand why the need was there. In fact, if you ask most people what their favorite gospel is, very rarely, unless it's somebody like you or I who have performed it, you almost never hear Mark as the favorite, because it's got a weird beginning, even like, well, where's the birth? Where's the, it just, right? And then the ending, just they don't know what to do with it. But having spent as much time in having embodied and performed Mark, it just it doesn't make any sense to me to add those other ones. I think it's absolutely in line with the character of the rest of his gospel.
Yeah, I agree. And I must say that from a dramatic point of view, some of the story isn't quite the same. There's some kind of, I don't know, some confusion. So it's hard to slot them together. And it is fair to say, isn't it, that the later ending was added later, insofar as it was in the 2nd century or so, wasn't it? Not at the same time, in different kinds of Greek. So, yeah. So, in terms of the actual ending, though, as you say, it is very abrupt, and there are all sorts of strange things going on in the ending. Shall we talk about things that really grabbed our interest? I'll let you go first. Perhaps at the beginning and moving on gradually through to the end. What sort of things grabbed your interest, Tracy?
Well, a couple things. As a female, there are a couple. There's the bleeding woman, or the hemorrhaging woman in 5, and which connects with the Jairus's daughter. But you don't get a lot of women. They kind of show up at the very end there, and then we're told like, oh, well, they supported Jesus. They followed him up to Jerusalem. It's like, oh, well, why didn't we hear those stories? So I do kind of like, even though they're maybe painted in not a great light in chapter 16. Because they don't do what they're told, and they remain silent. At the very beginning, I just love the beginning of chapter 16. Love that we have the women who that's one of the few things that all 4 gospels agree on, is that it was the women who were there through the end, and by end meaning even into the Sunday morning resurrection, kind of. Part of the story, and we see their grief, and this was traumatic. I often tell people that being 2,000 years after the fact, or longer if you're doing stories from the Hebrew scriptures, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage, because we already know how the story ends, and so we forget to be surprised or delighted or shocked or And we come to church on Easter morning, and we sing, Christ the Lord is risen today. Oh, it's just like, no, this is like fantastic. It's great news, And so, that's one of the things that the storyteller has an opportunity to do, in their embodiment and proclamation of it, to invite the audience to remember as if they're hearing this for the first time, and to be surprised and all that. So all that is to say is that, it's only 8 verses, but there's a lot jammed into that emotion wise. It's such a roller coaster of emotions, and and it's the women who get to share that with us.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love this idea of the roller coaster of emotion. I must admit, I remember there was a performance I did recently of this section, which maybe if we have time, I'll tell you about later, but it was really emotional in a fantastic way. Yeah. I'm just thinking about the women again. I'm interested you should pick them out. And you were saying you're not sure that they come across completely covered in glory because of what happened at the end. And I kind of agree. But on the other hand, they are the only ones who've stayed around, aren't they?
They are. So you can't take that away from them.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, if so the way that it ends, we're told that they say nothing to anyone.
Yeah.
But somebody must have told this story, right? So somebody must have been talking at some point, right? Yeah. And so in my mind, that kind of redeems them, yes. A little bit. We just don't get that in writing.
Yeah, I love that, and it is kind of, I feel it's almost like a joke on Mark's part that we're all listening to this story.
Exactly.
Apparently, the women never told anyone about it. So
right.
But yeah, I think the women are mentioned in the previous chapter, aren't they? Where they're talked about having followed Jesus. And they stay with him at his crucifixion, albeit from a distance. And they're also noted as serving him. And I think those kind of very positive descriptions are quite worth dwelling on. Because as I say, the men they're nowhere to be found at this point. They've run away completely.
Well, and we have to note too that there are plenty of examples in the very end, just the last couple of chapters of Mark leading up to this story, where it's all the men who are falling down on the job, as far as making the wrong choices. So it just sort of culminates in the women, being part of that as well. But we have plenty of examples of the men,
absolutely,
not being in the greatest of light.
And I'm just remembered by you mentioning that the men are told off by Jesus, aren't they, for not serving and being so big-headed and full of themselves and wanting to be one up on each other. And Jesus says, right. No, it's not the way to do it. You need to serve each other if you want to be great. And the fact that the women in this story are described as serving Jesus. The only other servant,
and providing for him, probably financially as well. That's and here's the thing. Regardless of what book of the Bible, so Mark is just one example, but like women's stories kind of get short shrift if you look at the percentages of stories in the whole Bible, and often the women are not named. And so when you do get a woman's story, and when you get her or them named, if there's more than one, that's a big deal. Like what was it about that person or those women, or what they were doing that made the writer or the original tellers say, okay, that's worth noting the specifics of, because it really is kind of rare that it happens. So when it does happen, I think we need to sit up and take notice.
That explains something to me, which has always puzzled me, actually, Tracy. The fact is they're named not only once, but twice, aren't they, in close proximity? So that may well be the reason that Mark really wants to alert us as to the importance of these characters.
Yes. Yeah. And again, because that's the one thing that the 4 Gospels do agree on is the role of these women played, up to the very end there.
And so the last are not the least. They are the first. The ones who stay with Jesus actually are the first, and those who are first, the disciples who are chosen, are indeed the last, perhaps in
That's very Jesus, isn't it? The first will be last and the last will be first.
First, yes. Oh, brilliant. Anyway, so thanks for that point. And in terms of anything else in that first part of the episode, is there anything else that kind of strikes you as being important to think about?
Well, as a performer, I do enjoy. Again, Mark is so kind of the the lean, mean fighting machine kind of thing. There's just sort of no extra fat in his details, except when there is.
Yes.
And so one of my favorites is when they're the calming of the storm in chapter 4, and a cushion. He's not only asleep in the stern, but he's on a cushion. Like, that just seemed like a weird detail, right? So every once in a while, Mark does throw an extra thing in there. But in this case, for the chapter 16, is how big the stone was, and so it was very large, and just again, like, why Mark, if he's going to go to the trouble of giving a little extra detail, which he rarely does, we need to pay attention to that, right? And so again, is that to point out that the miraculous aspect of this, because this would not have been an easy thing for a single person, or maybe even a couple of people. You have to be pretty strong to roll that away. And I do wonder too, like, what did the women think they were going to do? Like, they knew about this large stone.
Yes.
They wanted to were specifically told they were going to anoint his body. So I'm not sure how they thought they were going to be able to do that. And obviously now they didn't have to worry about it, but it's kind of just an interesting little detail there.
Yeah, that's fascinating, isn't it? I agree. It doesn't really explain why it's there, but it is an interesting detail. I think I read one commentary recently which says that the women were hoping to find a man who could roll the away.
Well,
that's complete speculation, of course.
Yes, right.
A little bit sexist, but on the other hand, the women say, "Who will roll away the stone for us?"
Right.
I must admit, I was struck by the timing of everything. It says when the Sabbath was over, doesn't it? And it also mentions the very early on the first day of the week, at least in my translation.
Yes,
and I must admit, I've got a good friend, a friend of this podcast called John Burnett, and he and I have discussed this passage in some detail. And he's mentioned to me this idea of the Sabbath, first of all, that clearly the women couldn't go to anoint Jesus' body because they would have to wait for the Sabbath to be over so they can do some work. And that does mean that this is the third day since Jesus had died, which kind of coincides, doesn't it, with what Jesus said would happen.
Correct.
So
3 times he predicts this.
so Jesus coming across as a prophet who can be trusted, who's reliable, who has authority, is coming through here as well. But the one thing that John said about this, which really surprised me, was about when he talked about the translation in the NIV says, very early on the first day of the week. And when I read that to him, he threw up his hands in horror. He said, how can they translate it that way? Because apparently the Greek doesn't say the first day. There's no first about it. It just says day one. Day one. And from his point of view, that is actually very important, because the only other time that expression is used in the whole Bible is Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, when God creates the light and the darkness. And at the end of that, it says in the NIV again, and that was the first day. But what it really should say is that is day one.
Day one. Yeah, nice.
And in the Greek Old Testament. So his view
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Is that there's a creation going on in Genesis, and what's going on here then? It's the new creation. Jesus is the beginning of the new creation of God. I think that's quite an ingenious view.
I like that a lot. Maybe you've heard the phrase the 8th day of creation, which is sort of the same thing, right? So we have the traditional days of creation, and then once everything's created, then what does that mean for people of faith now, right? So sort of like we begin a new life, a new view on the world, a new relationship with God, new relationship with other people, maybe even with ourselves, in that quote unquote eighth day, which would be another way of saying, day one, right? We're starting over again.
Day.
Yeah. Right.
And actually, that reminds me, because I think John mentioned this to me, that apparently baptismal fonts have 8 sides to them, and that some chalices have 8 sides. So that goes with what you're saying, I think, about the 8th day of creation.
There's a beautiful church in the Galilee where that commemorates the Sermon on the Mount, and so of course there are 8 beatitudes, but it's an octagonal church, and I never thought about it as far as sort of in terms of creation, but I can see that working as well. I'll have to look closer the next time I'm there.
Anyway, it's really interesting in this first part, isn't it? But anyway, the women ask who will roll away the stone, and they get to the tomb and they find that the stone which is really large, has been rolled away. And then they come to this very strange bit in the story, don't they, about the young man.
Yes.
He's apparently, the NIV says, he's a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. What are your thoughts about this individual?
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever given it a lot of thought. I always just sort of assumed it was an angel. It is interesting that he's not literally described that way. So that does leave it open to, other possibilities, I suppose. But, the fact that he's dressed in white, that he has knowledge that, I'm not sure how he would have. At the very least, there's like a close relationship with Jesus.
Yes, true.
Right. So otherwise, how would he have this knowledge, or God as Jesus, as the incarnated God. And maybe is he the one that rolled the stone away? Which again, if it was really large, we're not told how big and burly and strong he was, but he might have even needed help as a human to by himself to move that stone. So I just always figured it was some sort of divine being.
Yeah, I've always felt that too. I mean, again, there's a whole industry, though, I have to tell you, Tracy, written about this individual. And a lot of people seem to me, as I've read the various commentaries, to agree with you about the idea that he might be an angel. And I think 1 or 2 of them say something about how young men are described as, angels are described as young men in various parts of the Apocrypha, in Tobit and Maccabees. So that goes with that. And then the white robe. Well, in Revelation, apparently, angels are said to wear a white robe. So, that idea about the angel does seem to work. But other people who've been on this podcast have said to me over the couple of years, because we've done this podcast over a couple of years, but this passage keeps coming up in conversation. They've said to me, they say, but the young man. And then they say to me, where have you heard about the young man before in Mark's gospel? And I think, there is a young man, isn't there? Towards the end of chapter 14, there's a young man who follows Jesus after he's arrested. And the guards or the people try to seize him, and he escapes and he flees away naked. And he leaves the cloth, which he was wearing, on the ground there. And the young man is the same words are used of this individual. And I know one of the guests on this show, Ted Trost, I hope I'm not misquoting him here, but I think he then indicated to me he thought that the young man back in chapter 14 was also an angel. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. Interesting. But again, as I say, there's an industry about this because then I think some scholars go into some detail about the cloth, and it seems to me, or it seems to them, and I must admit, I think there's some point in this, that there are all sorts of echoes between various parts of the last section of this story. So you have the young man with the cloth, and the word for that, the cloth that he was wearing, is a Greek word, syndon. And then the word gets mentioned again in the next chapter because Joseph of Arimathea buys a linen cloth, a sindon, to bury Jesus in.
Yes.
And then you get the repetition of the word young man in very close proximity to the other two references. And so you begin to think, hold on, are the audience meant to pick up echoes here of various things going on? Are they meant to connect the dots in some way? And, and one view is, I'm not saying it's one I share, but it's an interesting one, that the young man in chapter 14 who escapes, well, in escaping, he escapes death. And isn't that what Jesus did?
Okay.
I'm not sure
I see where you're going here.
So there's all sorts of, kind of interactions going on, perhaps, in people's minds, at the very least, even if Mark didn't intend it, which might.
Right. Well, I've always made a connection between the cloth that he leaves behind as he runs away naked and the cloth that Joseph purchases. I'm not saying it was the same cloth, but I think that it's a biblical, and not just biblical, but a biblical tradition, literarily, not literally, but literarily, to do like sandwiches. So for instance, the best example is the one I mentioned earlier with Jairus, and then we're interrupted by the hemorrhaging woman, and then we go back to Jairus's story, right? And so when you have that any kind of like repetitions, then it's maybe important to look what comes between, like what's the sandwich, what's the meat of that sandwich in the middle, and to pay attention to that because it's probably important. And so I've almost just kind of looked at what happens between the leaving of the cloth and then the purchasing of the cloth in the end of Mark's gospel. But I never did make the connection between the young man and the young man. I'll have to give some thought to that.
Yeah, it is quite cool. Unfortunately, the word used for robe here isn't the same word as the word used for cloth.
Yes, so right.
You could say it's a bit tenuous. On the other hand, how much of an echo do you really need to make a connection? I don't know.
Right.
It's fascinating, isn't it? In terms of what else goes on in this passage, I know that we need to talk about the very end, don't we?
Yes, we do.
It's not only the fact that it's so abrupt, it's also what actually happens at the end that kind of is really, it's quite shocking, isn't it? And disturbing in a way.
It is.
Before we get there, is there anything else that we need to mention? Obviously, if we leave out the fact that the young man actually announces the resurrection, I think we'd be missing something quite important.
Well, and let me just say, to go back to your point you made earlier about Jesus being a trustworthy prophet, he is, predicted the third day, 3 different times. And we also get that reaffirmed with the young man saying, he's going to meet you in Galilee, just like he told you, right? And so again, it was like, we're not just pulling this from thin air, right? I mean, you all were really prepared, multiple times in the years that you spent with Jesus, and you clearly have maybe forgotten some of these things. So let me again remind you, kind of thing.
And just as he told you, does appear again, doesn't it, earlier on? And it's when Jesus, when Mark tells us that the disciples go into the town and they find the room where they're about to have the Last Supper, just as Jesus told them, very strangely. So it's almost like we're getting an indication, certainly in that part, that this is nothing is accidental, that it's all been kind of planned, and this section too, isn't it? It's not accidental, it's all part of God's plan.
But I like your idea too of, and we can trust this. I mean, so these are kind of like proofs, it's almost like Thomas, requiring proof. Of course, that's a different gospel, but just this, as humans, sometimes it's hard to go on faith or believe, and so perhaps that's part of what Mark is trying to do, is laying this out and then proving along the way that this is just like we said it was going to be, or he said it was going to be.
Absolutely true. That's right. I'm glad you mentioned that bit, because I just remembered that. I think it's quite fascinating. I wonder what your thoughts are, that the young man says to the women, go to his disciples, and then for some reason singles out Peter. It's a
Yes.
why he's had enough trouble already, hasn't he? And he's been singled out for particular notice here. What's going on there, do you think, Tracy?
Right. Well, and as the viewers and listeners will see shortly, when I tell the whole gospel, I call Peter Rocky and sometimes Rock, but the name Peter, Petra, rock, right? You're the rock that I'm going to build the church on. And so I do love, because sometimes he is as solid as a rock, but more often than not, he's more rocky. And even just with the echoes of Sylvester Stallone and all of his Rocky movies, I that's not far from how Peter might have been. This big, strong, good. His heart means well, but he isn't always quite. Doesn't quite always make the right decisions, or he's more impulsive, or So I actually kind of like those sort of modern day echoes or connections. But anyway, so when I tell this, I use that throughout, including in that verse, and I use Rocky instead of rock at that point. But I try to say it sort of tenderly or sort of like playfully. Because yes, poor old Peter, Rocky, he says to Jesus after the Last Supper, when Jesus says, "Yeah, you're all going to fall away, you're all going to desert me," and he's vows up and down, that he swears that these guys might do that, but I'm not going to do that. And when I perform that, I it's hard for me not to get a tear in my eye, as Jesus, saying, "Oh, Rock, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you're going to deny that you even know who I am, and not just one time or twice, but 3 times." And of course, that's what he does. And when Peter realizes, that's another time that Jesus predicts something that comes true, right? Yeah. And he breaks down and weeps, right? Because again, he means well, but he's human, like, right? So I feel like that because he was the one, other than Judas, I guess, who kind of messed up the most. And again, I would say even in some ways you could say more than Judas, in that he claims that he's not going to do that. Yes. He strongly vows that he won't do that. And within hours, so in some ways that perhaps could be seen as even worse. So I just feel like that is, God through Jesus, through the young man's way of acknowledging, he maybe needs this the most. Because he might be as much as, and if everybody else is grieving and afraid and whatnot, he's got a whole added layer, I think, of emotions, and they're probably none of them good. So I think that the singling out is, there's going to be an extra special olive branch, perhaps, or forgiveness or whatever, offered to Peter as a result.
I think I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's almost certainly what's going on, that Peter's included, isn't he? Deliberately, even though he's messed up the worst, as you say. The idea is he's still part of things, and the young man is saying, go into Galilee, because I suppose Galilee is where they need to start the process of their appointment as apostles. This is the beginning of the good news, which I know you'll illustrate again in a moment as we hear some of your performance. That they are now Jesus's representatives to spread this gospel message, and Peter's included in that, in the angel's message. So despite anything he's done, he's messed up in a really, really bad way, he's still included.
So grace is still offered and extended. Absolutely. Forgiveness and grace, are still extended to him.
Too, because we can't see ourselves in these disciples, can we?
Exactly. For years, I've said that in some ways, I of all the characters in the Bible, I resonate with Peter the most for these very kinds of, my heart, I mean well, I have good intentions, but right. But I love your, the idea of going back to Galilee to start. I think that there's an echo there with what we said earlier with day 1 or the 8th day of creation kind of thing. It's a circling back to where they began, right? They were all from Galilee. That's where their relationship with Jesus started. That's where his ministry started, and they were with him there at the beginning. And so kind of circling back to Galilee in some ways makes a lot of sense.
And I think another reason why circling back to Galilee makes sense, perhaps, is Galilee was that part of the world, wasn't it, where you were more in touch with the Gentiles than you would have been in Jerusalem. So you got Gentile territory quite close around you, and Jesus went into Gentile territory deliberately, it seems.
Yes.
The point that this kingdom, which he's talking about, is open to all. It's not just for Jews. And so the new dispensation of God's plan for humanity starts in Galilee for a good reason.
Right. Yeah. And if you've ever been there, it's just, that's the breadbasket, so it's fertile, it's green, of the country of Israel. And so, kind of makes sense, and just metaphorically, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And bread being such an important symbol in the whole of Mark's gospel.
Oh, yes. Yes.
So, yeah. So should we talk about the ending?
Yes.
I'll read it out. And it says this in verse 8 in the NIV. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid.
Yes.
And that's the end. So, thoughts?
Yes. So my thought is, and I am not a Greek scholar, but I've been told by good friends of mine who are, that the original, not only is it an enigmatic kind of odd ending in general, but it literally ends in the middle of a sentence. So we've cleaned that up in our English translations to make it a full and complete sentence. But the original is, they were afraid because, right, ... Right? So that's how I perform it. And I think, and again, this is one of the reasons why I think that this is the original ending, because there's just the implicit invitation for the audience then to ask themselves, like, how would I have responded to the good news of the resurrection? Would I have been silent? Would I have fled? Would I have been full of fear? And again, not that there were good reasons for them to feel that way, right? But I think, and so when I tell it, I try very much to a long pause, trying to make eye contact with as many people in the audience with a knowing, like, kind of a raised eyebrow, kind of like, like, what do you think? Like, how what's your response to this? And I think that just makes total sense, because as I sort of mentioned this earlier, when we were trying to reclaim the women and point out that the men had messed up too. I feel like the very end of Mark's gospel, you've got multiple times where people made the wrong choice. So the disciples fell asleep, when Jesus goes off to pray in Gethsemane, after he tells them, please stay awake. They desert Jesus, just like he said, right? When Peter says, no, I'm not going to do that. Once he's arrested, they all flee. Peter publicly denies even knowing who Jesus is, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The crowds, they choose a murderous insurrectionist over Jesus, when they have the chance to save him at the end, they make that choice. And then, of course, the women being silent after they were told to go tell everyone. So I feel like this is a culmination of a increasing escalations of wrong choices that end up being a cautionary tale. So it's not to say, hey, this is how you should act or emulate these characters. It's to say, oh no, we need to do the opposite. We need to use that as a cautionary tale and choose the opposite that they had all chosen. And so I just feel like, because this isn't the first time, but in very quick succession there at the end of Mark's gospel, you've got multiple people doing this. That's why for me, verse 8 makes that's one of several reasons that verse 8 makes the most sense to be the ending.
Yeah, I mean, actually, that's brilliant, and it just reinforces the point we were just talking about people messing up, and these guys, all of them, been messing up, making wrong choices, and it's incumbent on us, isn't it? What choices are we gonna make? Actually, yes. Are we gonna be afraid and not say anything, or are we gonna say something about what is true? So it's a fascinating challenge. I have to mention, however, my friend John Burnett again here. And I was trying to explain this to you earlier, wasn't I, Tracy, before we started recording? And I'm not sure I got it out very well, but I'll do my best. And if John wants to comment later, John, I hope you're listening. Please do write in a comment on YouTube or something like that. So John mentioned this to me the other day, and he said, have you ever noticed that the sentence that we've been talking about, which is unfinished, they were afraid because in the Greek, which is let's get this right, evolunto gar,
Gar, yeah.
in the Greek is very similar to another part of the Bible where you have a similarly strange ending to a sentence where Sarah is said to lie to the angel that she'd laughed about what the angel has said in Genesis chapter 18, verse 15, where it says in the Greek version of the Old Testament, evorithi ga. So it's almost the same construction, almost the same word.
Yeah.
And John's view is that for an audience who knew their Bibles, they would have been alert to that connection. And so we need to ask ourselves, what was going on in Genesis chapter 18, verse 15? And actually, it's a really, really important point in the whole of Jewish history, because that's the point the Lord tells Abraham he's going to have a son, and Sarah is 90 years old. So that's And the reason why that passage is so important is as soon as the ancient Jews read this story, they knew it was true because they themselves were the proof. They
exactly, yeah,
children of Abraham, the children of Sarah. So for an audience in Mark's day to listen to this, and let's say they did make that connection, they would perhaps see themselves in a similar way. The women are saying something very akin to what Sarah said. And what's the proof of what they've been talking about in this story? We're the proof.
Well, and it goes again to our point we've made several times about something being predicted that seems that whether or not it seems implausible, which in this case with Sarah for sure it does seem implausible, and a resurrection certainly seems implausible if you don't, right? And it coming true, right? So there's definitely an echo with that as well. Just the natural human reaction to disbelieve it or to be afraid, and to say, okay, well, like, here's the proof, just like I told you, kind of thing.
The proof, which is amazing. And I know John would probably take this further and say, that when the community got together, they would have their readings, and maybe the reading would be the whole of Mark's gospel. But immediately after that, they would break bread, they'd have communion. And the communion was a sign of their being the body of Christ. They are the representatives of Christ. Christ is alive, risen in them, and present in a very special way, albeit unseen.
Exactly. And in fact, my understanding is the story of the feedings, the 5,000, which is very much connected. I mean, and in Mark's gospel, you also have the feeding of the 4,000. And so it's a very similar sort of litany almost, as far as almost exactly the same thing for the 5,000, the 4,000, and then the Last Supper. And in the early church, you often will see that they've uncovered mosaics and all where they have the bread there for the feeding. So that was an integral part of their faith community and their understanding of what this whole movement of the way was all about. So I like that.
Thanks. So Tracy, we are going to listen to you in fact, if you're on YouTube, we're going to watch you do a performance of this section. But for everyone who is about to watch this, what you'll need to know is that Tracy immediately goes back to the beginning and does the first few verses of chapter 1 as well. Tracy, can you explain why you're about to do this.
Yes. So I have always thought that it would be fun to study the book of Mark through performance. Of course, somebody needs to know the whole gospel and be able to perform it. Since I do, I thought, let me look for an opportunity to do that. So with my little worshiping community, I was given the gift of it took just about a year long study of Mark through performance. So what I did is rather than doing chapter 1 week and chapter 2 the next week or whatever, I the first week I told I can't remember now if it was the whole of the first chapter or a big chunk of it, and we discussed it. And then the next week, rather than picking up where I had left off the week before, I just slid the passage ahead, maybe 12 to 15 or so verses. So they were hearing like about 2/3 of what they had heard the first week again. And then I added a third, if you will, and we discussed it. And then the next week slid it ahead. And so we were hearing the last part of the first week for the third time, the middle part of the second week for the second time, and the a new piece, for the third time. And so we just slowly through the year made our way through Mark that way, and as a result, we heard the whole book 3 times, wow. Right? And it was just being an educator at heart. It was good to have that reinforcement, that reminder, because this is different from what you and I often do, where in one sitting we hear the whole gospel. There's a week in between, so it was really helpful for those reasons. And also, you hear the context around each new passage does color it a little bit. You hear different things, you pick up different things, with this being what comes before this, and this is where you end, as opposed to maybe 2 weeks later. So that was the idea. But then I thought, well, what happens then when we get to the end of the book of Mark? And I hadn't thought of this specifically as a reason to do this whole endeavor, but I thought, well, we're going to have to circle back around and hear the beginning of Mark again, if for no other reason, just to be equal opportunity presenters here, right? We hadn't heard the beginning repeated 3 times. So when I got to the crucifixion, resurrection, and then the very beginning of Mark, and then our last week was what we're hearing here, this in this episode of the podcast, just chapter 16, and then the first 28 verses of the first chapter of Mark. And my community, we are not biblical scholars. We're just, and it was, I had no idea what to expect, but it was the thing I started to look forward to the most once I realized that's how, that's how it's going to play out. Yeah. And it just, for a lot of reasons. Number one is it kind of speaks to the weird ending of 16. They say nothing to anyone. And then, they were afraid. Now, why were they afraid? Right. But then you circle back around and you're reminded, remember, guys, this is good news, right? Yeah. And in the beginning of Mark, it's talking a lot about, proclaiming the message or preaching the message, right? And so kind of like, it's like, oh, right. Like, it might've been okay. And even, definitely very human, but forgivable for us to be afraid and silent, initially. And by us, I mean, not just the women, but like those of us today, how do we respond, as I asked earlier? And so to kind of get that reassurance, that, encouragement, to say, oh, right. This is the good news of God that needs to be proclaimed. And so ending at verse 28, that's where we've had Jesus baptized. We had him proclaimed by John the Baptist. He's been baptized. He gets his first couple of disciples. There's already a miracle in the form of a healing and teaching. We don't hear what he's teaching, but apparently it amazes everyone, because we've never heard it with such authority before, right? And right. So like right there, we're not even to the end of the first chapter yet, and you kind of get a microcosm of kind of and controversy, and all of that. And then chapter 28, or I'm sorry, verse 28 ends with, and the good news about him began to spread throughout the entire region of the Galilee. And it's just like, yes, that's sort of the corrective to the women being silent. So I'm getting chills right now, just thinking about it. And the interesting thing is, and then we'll watch it. right after I finished this year-long experiment with my little faith community, it was just a couple of weeks later, I was invited to perform the entire gospel for a church, and the pastor's a good friend of mine. He's hired me to do Mark multiple times, and so I said, "Hey, I know you've heard this a lot of times. I got an idea. Would you be open to?" And I explained the whole thing, that I had just done, and I said, "Would you be open to me circling back around?" And he's like, "Huh. Yeah, sure. Why not?" And I'm going to tell you, in one sitting, so not over a whole year with weeks in between, or a week in between each, but there in one sitting and then circling back around, I almost couldn't get to the end. I was so choked up, because I'm pointing to the spot where John had been so horrendously, beheaded for such stupid reasons. But then we come back around to the beginning, and here's John proclaiming, and like we had just heard the whole story and the crucifixion and the resurrection, and this is good news. Remember, right? This is good news. And so you're swinging back around through all that. It just, I got, and the audience too. Like it was really powerful. So I'm not saying that this is how it was originally intended to be heard or experienced, but let me just say it's a very powerful experience. So there you go.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you know, a whole load of things come up in my head, which I'm going to try out on you because I've never thought of them before. The first is that may explain something we were talking about earlier. We were talking about how the passage in chapter 16 relates to us as much as much as the gospel does, and so does the beginning. Actually, it's like and bringing it right round like that puts the onus on. This is what the kingdom of God is. This is what our role in it is. And certainly for the first disciples of Jesus, after his death and resurrection, it would have meant so much to them, wouldn't it? I mean, they would have been going through the possibility of persecution as they sent their message out. And Mark is all about, having to take your cross and denying yourselves if need be.
Right.
Wow.
Well, and the I think conventional wisdom is that this was written in the immediate aftermath of the Jewish war, and so there would have been a whole lot of reasons to be afraid and to want to be silent, and the need for encouragement and guidance, and and so to hear the story and have it end like what and I relate to the women, and I'm afraid, and but then to be reminded and have that be what you leave the audience with. I'm just telling you, it's pretty powerful.
Amazing. He will send his messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. It could be about Jesus himself. I've read that before in a commentary. It's not necessarily about John the Baptist. So our way has been prepared by Jesus himself, the way.
Well, and again, like now, 2,000 years later, we're in a position to proclaim that, right? To prepare the way.
Yeah.
So I think that's a possibility as well.
Yeah, I agree. Tracy, it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you. I'm hoping one day we'll do it again because it's been so good. Thank you so much.
I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's an honor to have been asked. And thank you for letting me do this this ending of Mark. That was the one that I thought, I'm going to have the most to say about that one. So thank you.
No problem at all. And I'm sure the viewers and listeners will enjoy it.
After the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, bought spices so that they might go and anoint his body. And very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, after the sun had risen, they made their way to the tomb. Now they had been saying to one another, "Who's going to roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" And looking up, they saw that the stone had already been rolled back. It was very large. And going into the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, seated at the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. Well, He's been raised. Well, he isn't here. Come, see the place where they laid him. Now, go and tell his disciples and Rocky that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. That's where you'll see him, just as he told you. Well, the women went out and they fled from the tomb because, well, terror and amazement had come upon them. And they said nothing to anyone. They were afraid because the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." And John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness of Judea, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Now, John wore clothing made of camel hair. He had a leather belt around his waist, and for food, he ate locusts and wild honey. Oh, and he preached, saying, "The one who comes after me is much more powerful than I. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie his sandals. Yes, I have baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." Well, in those days, Jesus himself came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And just as he was coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit of God descending like a dove and resting upon him. And a voice came from heaven saying, "You are my Son, whom I love. Oh, I am so pleased with you." And immediately the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. And he remained in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan. And he was with wild beasts. And the angels ministered to him. Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee, preaching the good news of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in this good news." And passing along by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea because they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Hey, follow me, and I'll teach you how to fish for people." And immediately they left their nets and they followed him. Well, going a little farther, Jesus saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James. Now, they were out in their boat mending their nets. And Jesus called to them. And immediately, they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired hands, and they followed him. Now, they went to Capernaum. And on the Sabbath, Jesus entered the synagogue, and he began to teach. Well, everyone was amazed at his teachings, because he taught them as one who had authority, and yet not like one of the scribes. Well, just then, in their synagogue, there was a man with an unclean spirit who cried out, saying, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. The Holy One of God, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing the man and crying in a loud voice, came out, leaving everyone utterly amazed. They said, What is this? A new teaching with authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. And immediately, news about Jesus began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee.
So everybody, thank you again for tuning in to this podcast on YouTube or on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And so without further ado, it's goodbye from Tracy Radosevic. And goodbye.
Radosevic, yes.
Sorry, apologies. And goodbye from me, Stefan. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.